The 2021 election was a gigantic waste of time and a gigantic waste of money. $610 million to be exact was wasted just to get basically the same result. We did learn something though. We learned that pivoting left to appease voters who hate you doesn't work and is not a viable strategy for conservatives. Erin O'Toole took this gamble to run as a progressive, moderate, and it didn't work out. In fact, he did worse in urban seats and urban areas than Andrew Scheer did, who's a SoCon from Saskatchewan. So now the Conservative Party is in this kerfuffle where they have to figure out whether they're keeping Erin O'Toole or whether they're going to go with someone else. This is what we're going to figure out today. I am speaking to Clinton Desveaux. He was an organizer for Stephen Harper. He's managed leadership campaigns. He's a Politico. We're going to get his insight on this, and we're going to figure out what the future of the Conservative Party is in this country. My name is Angelo Isidorou, and this is Cancel This. All right, Clinton, welcome to Cancel This.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to chatting with you and hearing from your listeners and viewers over the coming weeks.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, and obviously we just had a federal election, the big federal election that wasn't really big at all. It just cost a lot, and there's a lot of conversation about it. Basically, there's a lot of conversation over whether it mattered, and there's a lot of conversation over what happens to the conservatives. You obviously have a background in the conservative movement, and the reason why I wanted to talk to you today was to get an idea of what you think is happening to the conservative movement, and more specifically, the big debate, does Erin O'Toole need to go? So I don't know if we should just jump it right into it, if we want to do a recap of the election. I mean, what's your take on the election?
Well, I mean, again, this was another election that I believe the Conservative Party should have and could have won. But for a whole bunch of reasons related to, which I argue, poor communications, poor messaging, uh, strange non answers to basic questions. It cost the conservatives. And of course, that was to the benefit of the federal Liberal Party. So, look, I thought this election was a disaster. I really felt that the conservatives should have won a majority government. And it wasn't meant to be, unfortunately, as the campaign progressed. We kind of saw one mistake after another. And it's a shame because the first week of the campaign, it looked like the conservatives were kind of holding some momentum that they had put together. And then, the wheels came off of the wagon, as they say.
Yeah, it does seem like that, right? I mean, I think the writ drops and the conservatives are behind in the polls. I think people sort of had low expectations. And then all of a sudden, they just began creeping up 29%, 30%, 32, 34. I think the highest they got was something like 37%, which I think that's majority territory. And then at some
It is.
point,
So in
you know, at some point it just went down. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I interrupted you. So you're right. So when you hit 37% in Canada's parliament, where you have a five-party system, that gets you a majority government. And so there was a point where the Conservatives had positioned themselves to win, and it seemed like as soon as they got into that territory, that the party had a series of flip flops on issues related to firearms. So over the course of 7 days, I believe they took three or four different positions on firearms related issues, and that carried into another week where the party started to take different positions on issues related to its own carbon tax. And by the time we got to the end of the campaign, in the final week, the Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole was having great difficulty answering questions around the handling of COVID-19 in Alberta vis-a-vis Jason Kenney. And instead of just giving a straight answer and saying, look, I think he's done a terrible job and it's been a disaster, he thought he could do the political convenient thing and simply go silent and not answer the question. And when you go silent and you don't give an honest and specific answer to an easy question, it casts doubt in the minds of the public. And so, what was the result of that? Well, the result was the Conservative Party of Canada in 2021 received approximately 1 million fewer votes than the 2019 election. The result of that was fewer Conservative members of Parliament were elected in 2021 than 2019. The party finished with a smaller percentage of the vote in 2021 vis-a-vis 2019. The party lost multiple members of Parliament in Canada's largest urban centres. So the result is the party is now less urban and more rural. We have fewer women members of Parliament. We have, we're less ethnic or multicultural than we were in 2019. So you look at all of this and you say to yourself, this was a disaster. And so, I view it as a real problem. And, that's not to say that Erin O'Toole's a bad guy. I don't think he's a bad guy. I've known Erin sort of periodically off and on over the last 2.5 decades. And, he has a lot of history in the party. He comes from a well-connected family that's connected in the Conservative family in Ontario. He has deep roots in the Conservative family of Atlantic Canada, and specifically Nova Scotia. But none of that translated to growth. The party took a step backwards from Andrew Scheer's performance in 2019.
I think that's what I wanted to ask you about next, because everyone sort of crucified Scheer in 2019. He reduced Trudeau to minority, but the knives came out pretty much right away for Scheer. And I guess it's because people thought that was a winnable election. But now in hindsight, it's interesting. You mentioned the urban ridings. A pro-choice GTA leader performed worse in the GTA than a SoCon from Saskatchewan. I think that's, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but I think that to me is the biggest indictment, in the sense that the whole strategy of becoming a more progressive Conservative Party, of sort of leaving the base and pivoting left on these issues, was to attract those urban voters, but it didn't happen. So that's kind of baffling to a lot of people. In terms of how was Scheer able, a SoCon who has nothing in common with a GTA voter, how is he able to perform better in Vancouver and in the GTA, whereas Erin couldn't? That's sort of baffling to me.
Well, this goes back to some of these policy flip-flops and communications issues that the Conservative parties had. So, upon winning the leadership of the Conservative Party, literally within the first 2 weeks, Mr. O'Toole's first major announcement was to say that a Conservative Party led by him would not balance Canada's budget for at least a decade or more. Those are his words, not mine. A decade or more. So right away, you would have a large number of fiscal conservatives that would hear that sort of messaging and would say to themselves, wow, this is not the sort of Conservative Party that I feel comfortable in. And of course, this was a gigantic flip-flop from the positions that Mr. O'Toole took in the process of winning the leadership of the party, where he painted himself as this fiscal hawk who had libertarian leanings and believed in a lean, mean, efficient government. And the minute he shows up to Parliament in Ottawa, he's talking about not balancing budgets for at least a decade or more. If
So
we
do you
look
think,
at
sorry to interrupt, but do you think that is the great indictment? Do you think that it is, and I'm not saying worse morally here, this isn't a moral conversation, but in terms of electoral value, is it worse to be a flip-flopper than it is to be a SoCon from Saskatchewan? Like, do voters hate that more? Do voters hate someone who won't die on any hill more than they hate SoCons?
Well, Look, I wouldn't say they hate the person, like people like that, but I would argue that they dislike them more. And I would argue that you're better to pick a lane and consistently defend whatever your worldview is and your positions than you are to say one thing one day and then completely take a different position the next day. And the reason I believe that you need to pick a lane is because it ends up casting doubt in the minds of the public. And so the public starts to wonder, what is it that you want to accomplish? What is it that you want to achieve? And do you have a hidden agenda? Is there a reason why one minute you're for balanced budgets and the next minute you're not? One minute you're against carbon taxes, the next minute you're in favor of carbon taxes. And so when you go through all these issues, it voters, they couldn't trust him. And and so voters quite often will choose the devil they know than the devil they don't know. And I would argue that the Prime Minister Trudeau, that he won the smallest percentage of vote in Canadian history, in order to win the prime ministership, and that tells me that Canadians were starving for an alternative. They were looking for someone that they could trust and someone they could believe in, but they couldn't find that person. And so instead, they reelected Mr. Trudeau. And so that should be a reminder to conservatives as to how unappealing Mr. O'Toole is. And that's an important lesson to take from this 2019 election, or from this 2021 election.
Yeah.
And, that's a real problem that the party has.
Yeah, it is kind of shocking that Trudeau, I mean, he won with the lowest, you know, vote count. He's the most unpopular prime minister. He's super unpopular, and yet he won just by default. It's sort of, again, that's an indictment on him for being extremely unfavorable, but it's also an indictment on the Conservatives for not being able to provide that alternative. So now the question is, again, going back to 2019, they gutted Scheer. They really, really got rid of him, and he was out very quickly after the 2019 election. Well, first of all, do you foresee something like that happening to Erin O'Toole? That's number one. And number two, should that happen, in your opinion?
So, what we've seen is that newly elected members of parliament have come out and criticized Mr. O'Toole, and former Conservative members of parliament have been criticizing Mr. O'Toole in the days immediately following the election. And some of the Conservative Party's closest friends, like the Conservative Talk radio community across Canada, has been openly complaining about Mr. O'Toole. We've seen a senior ranking member of the Conservative Party's National Council. And for your viewers that don't know what the National Council is, it's an elected body that essentially governs the Conservative Party and looks after the infrastructure of the Conservative Party. And so a senior member of the National Council has circulated a petition calling on a leadership review. And we're reading reports in the various national dailies that there are members of parliament in the Conservative Party that would like to have an immediate review of Mr. O'Toole. So I think he might be able to hang on in the short term, maybe over the next month. But I do think that probably by the Christmas break, he'll be gone. And the reason I argue that is because the pressure will start to build. And at some point, he'll realize that he doesn't have a team of people around him that support him and believe in him. And in order for a leader to lead, they need a chain of command and followers to follow them. And I don't think Mr. O'Toole has that.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of MPs who are, now former MPs, for whatever influence they still have, that are fairly disgruntled at the moment at the fact that they lost their seats due to vote splitting from the PPC, which, a lot of that could be attributed to O'Toole's failure to keep the base together. I mean, I imagine, like you said, Alberta MPs are probably livid um, over over the election results. I mean, I think there's even a Liberal seat in Alberta now, which is sort of crazy to think about.
Yeah, well, in
Uh,
fact, there's a couple of Liberal seats in Alberta now, and some New Democrats. So we're seeing, we're seeing other political parties being elected in the conservative heartland of Canada.
yeah, so to that end, I mean, so you think he's going to be gone? That's your prediction. That's the Clinton DeVoe prediction that Erin O'Toole is toast by Christmas. Um, do you think that's the right thing to do? What do you say to the argument of, look, we can't keep recycling through these leaders. You need to give him a couple election cycles to build his profile and his favorabilities and to become a recognizable brand. We can't just keep recycling these leaders. How would you respond to that argument?
Yeah, I don't buy into that argument at all. That's not to say that there's not a time and a place to keep leaders. So, for example, if we look at former Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister Stephen Harper, he was able to take a Liberal majority government and turn it into a Liberal minority government. And then the following election, he was able to reverse a Liberal minority into a Conservative minority government and eventually a majority. What we have seen with Mr. O'Toole, unfortunately, is a step backwards. Instead of seeing progress, we're seeing a reversal. So we're seeing fewer MPs, a smaller percentage of the vote, fewer overall votes. And when you look at the sort of the breakdown of the results, I mean, it was a disaster. So, for those reasons, I think that it is the right thing to do, and I think that and again, it's not, it's not a personal issue with me. It's purely a performance issue, and when people argue that well, you have to give people multiple chances, like you can do that under certain circumstances, but it usually doesn't turn out well. Like I'm reminded of John Turner, 1984, right? Brian Mulroney won the largest majority government in Canadian history, and Liberals convinced themselves that somehow Turner could turn it around, and of course Turner failed in 1988, his second election. Do we see Republicans or Democrats in the United States being given a second shot at presidential runs? Not very often. And the reason we don't is because the public figures out that they're not capable of winning. And I do think that the Conservative Party, that there are other faces out there and that there are other more more winnable candidates that probably have a better shot at forming government than Mr. O'Toole.
So let's get into that then. Let's say we're down the road now, and O'Toole has failed to hold on to his power, and there's an interim leader, and there's a leadership election called. We obviously don't know who's running. We can take a good guess, but in your opinion, with everything in mind, everything that's going on with these urban centers, with conservatives splinting off, who is that uniter? Who is that conservative MP, if he or she is even an MP currently? In your opinion, who do you think is up for the job?
Well, I think there's a few names we could put on that list. Now, I'm not saying that they're all likely to become Erin O'Toole's successor, but I do think that there's a legitimate list of people. So the most obvious one would be former Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's still a young man. He's still widely respected in the party, and he's respected across the country. So he would obviously be someone that a lot of conservatives would look to. When it comes to the sitting caucus, the most likely person would be a member of parliament from Ottawa, in fact, Pierre Poilievre. Here's a conservative member of parliament who has been able to be elected multiple times in one of Canada's largest urban cities, and he does so convincingly. So that would make Mr. Polyev an obvious front runner as well. Um, if we go back to the previous leadership race, perhaps Peter MacKay can be convinced to come back and take another go at it. Then there's another person from Western Canada. Well, two people I can think of in Western Canada that would be potential successors. One of them would be Michelle Rempel Garner. She seems to have generated a large following across the country. And then there's another fellow by the name of Garnet Genois, who some people argue has leadership aspirations. But I think out of all of those, the most likely person would probably be Pierre Poilievre, because he brings Western Canadian roots in combination with always being elected in an urban city like Ottawa, one of the only conservatives to ever get elected in Ottawa. And he's fluently bilingual. So the combination of all of those tools, plus the fact that he has a large social media following, and he appears to be quick on his feet, and he appears to come up with good sound bites, that would make him a front runner. But again, that's not to dismiss any of the other names I've included on that list. Very few people could criticize Mr. Harper. I mean, he was prime minister for a decade.
Yeah.
Peter MacKay, former co-founder of the party. Michelle Rempel Garner is an important voice in the Conservative Party, and one of the most powerful women on Parliament Hill today, who has generated a large following across the country.
Yeah, it's not for a lack of, personnel. Like that's kind of the crazy thing. That was the crazy thing even in the last leadership, is that there's a lot of people in this movement that are actually pretty powerful. Pierre Poilievre, I think, stands out because a lot of us felt almost an awkwardness in the fact that Pierre Poilievre, even before the writ dropped for the election, would release these videos that sometimes would get millions of views, and he would go on trending on Twitter and Google. And it's bizarre for someone who's not the leader of a party, who's just a member of parliament, for a small riding, to get that sort of attention. And I wonder if that's possibly why he was demoted. So Pierre Poilievre, in my head, stands out because you're right. He represents a suburban riding, and yet he's unabashedly conservative. He's aggressively conservative, some would argue. His opponents would argue that he's aggressively conservative. And yet he wins in the suburbs of Ottawa.
Well, the thing that also makes someone like Mr. Poilievre an interesting possible choice is that he's very effective in the House of Commons during things like question period, when bills and debates are being debated in the House of Commons. He's very, very effective at getting his point across, and doing so in very quick sound bites. And that's really important for an official opposition leader that wants to try to replace a sitting government, because question period affords the opposition leader a chance to showcase their skills and abilities to the public at large.
Yeah, and I think he is intellectually gifted. He's someone who I believe would not reject an invitation to appear on Jordan Peterson's podcast. I think he's someone who would embrace that and potentially unite conservatives, both right-leaning, hardline conservatives and your more red Tory types. He seems to have the best of all worlds. So again, not to poo-poo everyone else we've mentioned, but I think the writing is sort of on the wall a little bit on this one, if O'Toole doesn't hold on. So I think what remains to be seen in the next few months is whether the knives do come out. We've already seen some conflict. Will it continue? Will he hold on? These are all questions and answers that we're going to find out eventually. But to close it off, what is your overall impression, or feeling of optimism, if you have any, for the future of the conservative movement in this country?
Well, look, earlier in the conversation, we talked about the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau was elected with the smallest percentage of vote in Canadian history. So, what that tells me is that Canadians really do want to vote for a conservative leader that's capable of winning. I think what that also tells us is we need to find the right leader that can inspire Canadians to embrace the Conservative Party. And so that is going to come down to, coming up with great messaging, great communication skills, an ability to articulate a vision that connects with Canadians from Newfoundland to British Columbia and all points in between. And I think if the Conservative Party can find a successor to Mr. O'Toole that has those traits and those abilities, I believe that Canadians will embrace the Conservative Party, and I believe the party could potentially win a majority government. And it's important that the membership at large, that the National Council, that the Conservative Fund of Canada that controls the money of the party. It's important that all these different components of the party come together and come up with some clear communications that they can direct to Mr. O'Toole in order to convince him of the necessity to perhaps consider stepping down.
I was being a little tongue in cheek before when I mentioned, that Pierre wouldn't say no to appearing on Jordan Peterson's podcast. I mentioned that because for those of you who don't know, Erin O'Toole declined an interview with Jordan Peterson while Maxime Bernier didn't. So obviously, Maxime Bernier got this huge platform with the best-selling author in Canadian history, and Erin O'Toole didn't want to do it because why? Because it's controversial. I don't know what the reason is, but what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think that was the right move to decline Jordan Peterson?
Well, look, that's another example of some of the failures in Aaron O'Toole's communications strategies. Because Jordan Peterson is someone who a large number of conservative minded Canadians respect and really enjoy. And so, we saw Mr. Bernier show up on the Jordan Peterson show. And by Mr. O'Toole declining an invitation, at least according to Jordan Peterson declining an invitation, what did this do? It allowed Mr. Bernier to increase his percentage of the overall vote and help split votes with the conservatives. So it ended up harming Mr. O'Toole in the end. And the right thing to do would have been to say, you know what? This is a guy that's widely respected by Canadians all over the country. What's the harm in doing an interview with the guy? And so, look, that's another example of poor communications and strategies from the O'Toole camp, unfortunately.
Well, widely respected in Canada, widely respected all over the world. I mean, he's basically a global superstar at this point. And I should note that he's appeared on this show. You should check that episode out. But yeah, I think it's this sort of Laurentian, elitist, smug thing that these strategists or consultants have where they sit down and say, well, this is too controversial and 7 people on Twitter are going to become upset. So we're not going to go on this because we don't want to make people who already hate us more. It's like you're not going to get the votes of social justice warriors no matter what. So declining Jordan Peterson only helps your opponents to the right with Mr. Bernier, right? Like if you want to be a true conservative party, then you got to compete for it and you got to engage with prominent conservatives.
Well, I'd go a step further by declining the interview with Jordan Peterson, knowing that your opponent to the right of you, Mr. Bernier, accepted it. That's an example of suppressing your vote. And knowing that the polling numbers were starting to sag as the campaign was dragging on, and intentionally doing something to suppress your vote even further makes no sense. So, for all of those reasons, I think Mr. O'Toole's in trouble.
Right, right. Well, we'll find out. And when we do find out, I'd like to have you back on so we can figure out what else is going to be happening in this bizarre political landscape we live in. There's a whole bunch of other news today about Anime Paul is out and all these other things going on. But this is what I'll say. First of all, thank you for coming on. Second of all, this was sort of a rebound from a Twitter space we did with a whole bunch of other people. If you're on Twitter, make sure to follow the Post Millennial, because we do these Twitter spaces where we get all these politicos together, including Clinton, and we talk about what's going on in politics in Canada. So make sure you do that. But Clinton, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope to do this again with you sometime.
Great. I enjoyed this. I'm looking forward to chatting with you another time and hearing from your viewers.
That was Clinton Desveaux. I'm going to plug his social media down below in the description. Give him a follow and let me know what you thought of the episode. I thought it was a really fruitful conversation. Let us know what you think, because we have our own predictions and we like to pretend like we know everything when really we're just riffing. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you think Erin O'Toole is toast? And if so, who do you think will replace him? Until next time, my name is Angelo Isidorou, and this is Cancel This.